I'm Kate, and this is my veiled confession, an unforeseen connection. What my nephew did while massaging my back was one of the craziest and most exciting moments of my life. But you have to wonder how I ended up with my nephew massaging my back. Let me tell you, it all started a couple of months ago on a normal Friday. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those days where the world outside felt still, as though even the air had taken a pause. I had spent most of the morning catching up on chores that had been piling up for weeks, cleaning, reorganizing the closet, and tackling the endless dust that seemed to settle on every surface no matter how often I wiped it away. By the time I finished, my body felt heavy, every muscle in my back screaming for a break. David, my husband, had left for work hours earlier, leaving the house to me and the familiar routine that filled my days. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself longing for rest. My back ached, my shoulders were tense, and every step felt like a reminder of the toll that years of doing everything for everyone else had taken on my body. I had just decided to lie down for a quick nap when the knock came at the door. It was Joel, my nephew. At 22, he had grown into a confident and capable young man, though still polite and reserved in a way that was almost charming. He was David's sister's son and had been staying with us temporarily while sorting out his next steps in life. "Hey, Aunt Kate," he said as he stepped into the room, his voice warm and familiar. "You look exhausted. Can I do anything for you?" I smiled weakly, gesturing to the chair by the bed. "Just tired, that's all," I replied. "This house doesn't clean itself." Joel chuckled softly, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. "You should take a break," he said, his tone light yet insistent. "You've been pushing yourself too hard." His words caught me off guard, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't unusual for Joel to show concern, but there was something about the way he said it that felt different. I hesitated for a moment, then let out a tired laugh. "A back rub would be nice," I said jokingly, though a part of me wouldn't have minded. To my surprise, Joel nodded. "Sure," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I can do that." I blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You don't have to," he interrupted gently, already moving to sit behind me on the bed. "I know how to help, just relax." Before I could protest further, his hands were on my shoulders, his touch firm but not uncomfortable. I let out a sigh, the tension in my muscles already beginning to ease. It had been so long since anyone had taken the time to care for me in this way, and I found myself leaning into the sensation, grateful for the moment of relief. "You've been carrying a lot of stress," Joel said softly, his fingers kneading into the knots in my shoulders. "You should let yourself rest more often." I nodded, my eyes closing as I focused on the rhythm of his hands. "Easier said than done," I murmured. "There's always something that needs to be done." "Well, you've done enough for today," he replied, his voice dropping to a soothing tone. "Let me take care of you for a change." The words sent a strange warmth through me, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. There was a sincerity in his tone that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. As his hands moved lower, working their way down my back, I felt myself relax further, the weight of the day melting away. But then something shifted. His touch changed, subtle at first, but enough to make me notice. His hands lingered a moment longer than they should have, the pressure of his fingertips more deliberate. I opened my eyes, suddenly hyper-aware of the closeness between us, of the way his breath brushed against the back of my neck. "Is that better?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. I nodded stiffly, though my body felt anything but relaxed. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick, unspoken current that made my pulse quicken. I told myself I was imagining things, reading too much into a simple act of kindness. But the way his hands moved, the deliberate slowness, the way his touch felt more intimate than casual, made it impossible to ignore the growing unease in my chest. "You're always so strong," Joel murmured, his voice low and smooth. "You deserve to feel taken care of." I froze, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the situation. But his hands didn't stop. They moved lower, tracing the curve of my spine with a gentleness that felt both soothing and unnerving. My skin prickled under his touch, a mixture of sensations I couldn't quite define. "Joel," I said finally, my voice shaky but firm. "That's enough." He paused, his hands stilling for a moment before he leaned closer. "I just want you to relax," he said softly, his breath warm against my ear. "You've done so much for everyone else, let me do this for you." His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my body tense instinctively. I wanted to pull away, to stand up and put distance between us, but I was frozen, caught in the grip of confusion and something deeper, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I mean it, Joel, I said, my voice trembling. You need to stop. For a moment, I thought he would listen. His hands withdrew slightly, his breath hitching as if he were about to apologize. But instead, he leaned closer, his lips brushing lightly against my ear as he whispered, "You're beautiful, Aunt Kate. You always have been." The words sent a shock through me, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, the room seemed to close in around me. Joel's whisper hung in the air, heavy and intimate in a way I couldn't ignore. I turned my head slightly, enough to catch his face out of the corner of my eye. What I saw left me frozen. His expression was calm, too calm, but his eyes carried a heat I hadn't seen before. It was unsettling, a mix of admiration and something deeper that made my pulse race for all the wrong reasons. "Joel," I began, but my voice faltered. What could I say? What words could untangle the mess we were teetering on the edge of? "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly, his hands still resting on my shoulders. You deserve to know how much you're appreciated. How beautiful you are." The sincerity in his tone was disarming, but it didn't erase the weight of what he'd said or the way his touch lingered as if testing the boundaries. My body tensed beneath his hands, every nerve on high alert, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Part of me wanted to believe it was nothing, just a poor choice of words or an innocent moment taken too far. But the way his fingers trailed along my back told a different story. "Joel," I said again, this time more firmly. "You need to stop. This isn't right." He withdrew his hands, but he didn't move away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Why not?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with a strange mix of defiance and vulnerability. "What's so wrong about wanting to make you feel good? You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Don't you deserve this?" His words hit me like a slap, both because of their audacity and because of the truth buried within them. It was true. I had spent years putting everyone else's needs above my own, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of family, appearances, of obligation. But that didn't excuse this, it didn't make what he was saying, or what he was doing, okay. "This isn't about me," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about boundaries, respect. And this crosses a line." For a moment, Joel looked as though he might argue, his lips parting as if to protest. But then he closed his mouth, his jaw tightening as he nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone didn't quite match the words. "I didn't mean to upset you." The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but I seized the opportunity to create some distance. "It's fine," I said quickly, standing up and moving toward the door. Let's not talk about this again, okay?" "Okay," he replied softly, but it was the tone behind his words that left me uncertain. "If that's what you want." I paused at the doorway, my hand hovering over the handle as I turned back to glance at him. He was still sitting on the bed, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked on mine. There was something in his expression that made my stomach churn, a quiet confidence, as though he hadn't heard a word I'd said. I left the room without another word, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic blur. We both knew this wasn't over. And we were right, something was still coming that we could never have imagined. Something that would surprise me like crazy, eventually spiraling into something extremely exciting. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I busied myself with small tasks, folding laundry, sorting through mail, wiping down the countertops, but nothing could distract me from the knot of anxiety in my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel Joel's hands on my shoulders, hear the way his voice had softened as he whispered in my ear. The memory made my skin crawl, but it also left me with a lingering unease I couldn't shake. When David came home that evening, I tried to act normal, plastering on a smile and asking about his day as if nothing had happened. But the guilt sat heavy in my stomach, a constant reminder of the boundary I hadn't been quick enough to enforce. Joel kept his distance, offering polite nods and casual conversation that only made me feel more unsettled. It was as though he were playing a role, putting on a mask that no one but me could see through. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should I tell him? Should I confront Joel again? Or should I pretend it hadn't happened, bury the memory, and hope it never resurfaced? The weight of the decision felt suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to make a choice. Instead, I tossed and turned, my body restless, even as exhaustion tugged at the edges of my consciousness. The next morning, I woke early, my body stiff from a restless night. I padded into the kitchen, hoping a cup of coffee would help clear the fog in my mind. The house was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound as I moved through the familiar motions of brewing coffee and buttering toast. But then Joel entered the room, and the stillness shattered. "Morning, Aunt Kate," he said, his tone light and casual as he poured himself a glass of orange juice. "Sleep well?" I froze for a moment, my hand hovering over the toaster. "Fine," I said shortly. The tightness in my voice betrayed me. He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady as he studied me. "You seem tense," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with something darker. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I replied, my tone clipped as I avoided meeting his eyes. "Just a lot on my mind." "Well, if you ever need to talk." He let the sentence hang in the air, his smile soft but knowing. "I'm here." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I busied myself with buttering my toast, desperate to avoid his gaze. But his presence loomed behind me, too close, too deliberate. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin crawl. "I appreciate that," I said, forcing a polite smile as I turned to face him. "But I'm fine." "Really?" He nodded, his expression unreadable as he sipped his juice. "If you say so," he said lightly, but there was an edge to his tone that made my stomach churn. I turned back to the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to focus on the mundane task of eating breakfast. But deep down, I knew that things wouldn't go back to normal, not after what had happened, not after the line that had been crossed. The coffee mug in my hands felt too hot, but I didn't move to set it down. Instead, I stood at the kitchen counter, staring out the window and letting the rising steam blur my view of the garden behind me. I could hear Joel moving around the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his presence impossible to ignore. Every muscle in my body tensed as if bracing for something, though I didn't know what. "I've been thinking," Joel said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. It was calm, almost too calm, like he'd been rehearsing the words in his head. "About yesterday." My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't turn around. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, the garden blurring further as my breath fogged the glass. "There's nothing to think about," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was a misunderstanding." "Was it?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. I turned slowly, gripping the mug tightly as though it were the only thing keeping me grounded. Joel stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes intense. There was something unnerving about the way he looked at me, unwavering, as though he could see through every layer of my defenses. "Yes," I said firmly, meeting his gaze even though it made my stomach churn. Joel tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think it was," he said softly. "I think you felt it too." The words sent a jolt through me, and I tightened my grip on the mug until I was afraid it might shatter. "This isn't appropriate," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "You need to stop." "Why?" he asked, taking a step closer. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet persistence in it that made my pulse race. "Because it scares you? Because it makes you feel something you don't want to admit?" "Joel," I snapped, setting the mug down on the counter with a clatter. "You're crossing a line." He stopped, his expression softening, but his gaze remaining steady. "I don't want to upset you," he said quietly. "But I can't pretend I don't see what's happening here." "There's nothing happening," I said quickly, my words rushed and defensive. "You're imagining things." For a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, almost suffocating, and I struggled to steady my breathing. Joel's gaze didn't waver, but he didn't move closer either. Instead, he leaned back against the counter, his posture casual despite the tension radiating from him. "You deserve to be happy," he said finally, his voice softer now. "You deserve to feel seen." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I turned back toward the window, blinking rapidly as I tried to compose myself. The garden outside seemed impossibly distant, the vibrant colors muted by the fog of my own thoughts. "You don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't about you?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself, Aunt Kate? When was the last time someone made you feel special?" His words struck a nerve, and I felt my resolve begin to crumble. It wasn't fair, the way he seemed to know exactly where to push, exactly which insecurities to exploit. I hated how much truth there was in his questions, how deeply they cut into the loneliness I had been trying so hard to ignore. "I'm fine," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. "I don't need anyone to take care of me." "I think you do," Joel said simply, his voice steady and calm. "And I think you're too afraid to admit it." I turned to face him again, my chest tightening as his words sank in. There was no malice in his expression, no smugness or arrogance, just a quiet determination that made it impossible to dismiss him outright. "This conversation is over," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "I need you to leave." Joel hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching mine. Then he nodded slowly, pushing himself away from the counter. "If that's what you want," he said softly. "But I'm not going anywhere, Aunt Kate. You can't just pretend this doesn't exist." As he left the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance, I let out a shaky breath. Leaning heavily against the counter, my hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the sound of footsteps behind me made my heart jump. I turned to see Joel standing in the doorway, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't say anything, but the intensity in his gaze spoke volumes. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice careful. "I wanted to check on you," he said simply, stepping into the room. "You've seemed off today." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, my tone defensive. "Just tired." Joel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the couch, sitting down beside me with a casual ease that felt too deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, my pulse quickening as his presence filled the space around me. "You don't have to keep pushing me away," he said softly, his voice low. "I'm not the enemy here." "Then stop acting like one." I shot back, my frustration breaking through. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not trying to make it hard," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm trying to make you see that it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to carry everything on your own." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood up, putting as much distance between us as I could. "I need some air," I said shortly, heading toward the door without looking back. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped onto the back porch. The sky was dark, scattered with faint stars, and the distant hum of crickets filled the silence. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake off the tension that had built up over the day. The conversation with Joel had left me rattled, his words looping endlessly in my mind. "You deserve to feel seen." I leaned against the railing, staring out into the shadowy expanse of the yard. It was infuriating how his voice seemed to echo in my thoughts, how he'd managed to touch on feelings I had worked so hard to suppress. Loneliness wasn't a stranger to me, it was an old companion I'd learned to live with. But the way Joel spoke, the way he looked at me, threatened to drag those feelings to the surface, forcing me to confront things I wasn't ready to face. "Aunt Kate?" The sound of his voice startled me. I turned quickly to see Joel standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. But there was a tension in his posture that told me he wasn't just here to chat. "I needed some air," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "You should go back inside." He didn't move. Instead, he stepped out onto the porch, letting the door swing shut behind him. The sound made me flinch, and I took a small step back, my hands gripping the railing tightly. "You've been avoiding me all day," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, though my voice wavered. "What happened yesterday? It was a mistake." "It didn't feel like a mistake to me," he said, his tone calm but firm. The words sent a jolt through me, and I shook my head quickly, trying to dispel the weight of them. "You don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "This can't happen. It shouldn't have happened." "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because it scares you? Because it makes you feel something you don't want to admit?" "Stop," I said sharply, holding up my hand as if to ward him off. "This isn't up for discussion, Joel. You're crossing a line." "I'm not the only one crossing it," he said, his voice low and insistent. "You can tell yourself whatever you want, but I see the way you look at me. I know you feel it too." The accusation made my chest tighten, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. "You don't know anything," I snapped, though the words felt hollow. "You're imagining things." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was suffocating, the air around us thick with unspoken words. Joel took another step closer, his presence overwhelming, and I found myself frozen in place, unable to move or speak. His eyes searched mine, his expression a mix of determination and something else, something softer, almost pleading. "I just want to understand," he said quietly. "Why are you so afraid to let yourself feel this? To let yourself be happy?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "Don't you get that? Whatever this is, it's wrong." Joel didn't flinch at my words. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was soft, hesitant, but it sent a shock through me, my breath hitching in my throat. "It doesn't feel wrong to me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels real." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, I felt my resolve waver. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, as his hand lingered on mine, his gaze holding me captive. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said eventually, his voice low and coaxing. "You don't have to carry everything on your own." His words, spoken with such conviction, felt like a lifeline and a trap all at once. "Joel," I whispered, my voice trembling. We can't." "We already have," he said, his tone steady. "And you can't pretend it didn't mean something." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was, I couldn't because he wasn't wrong. The connection between us, the pull I felt every time he was near, was impossible to ignore, no matter how much I wanted to deny it. "Please," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "Just go inside, please." For a moment, I thought he might argue. His jaw tightened and his eyes searched mine, as though looking for some sign of doubt, some crack in my defenses. But then he nodded slowly, stepping back and letting his hand fall away from mine. "I'll go," he said quietly, "but this isn't over." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I watched in silence as he turned and walked back into the house, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a long time, my hands gripping the railing as I tried to steady my breathing. The night air felt heavy now, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. When I finally went back inside, the house was dark and silent. I moved through the shadows, avoiding Joel's room as I made my way upstairs. My bedroom door felt like a barrier, a small but necessary line between me and the chaos that seemed to follow him. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his words echoed in my mind, refusing to be silenced. "This isn't over." And wow, he was right, it wasn't. The next morning, I awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Sleep had been fitful, fractured by restless dreams and the echo of Joel's words. My body felt heavy as I sat up, the weight of everything pressing against my chest. I needed clarity, space to think, but the house itself felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to carry his presence, his voice, his touch. Determined to distract myself, I threw on a light sweater and headed downstairs. The familiar smell of coffee brewing wafted through the air, but the sight of Joel at the kitchen table stopped me in my tracks. He sat with a mug in his hands, his gaze fixed on the window as if lost in thought. When he noticed me, his expression softened into something unreadable. "Morning," he said, his tone casual. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing. "Morning," I finally replied, moving toward the counter without making eye contact. "You didn't sleep well," he said, more a statement than a question. "I slept fine," I lied, keeping my back to him as I poured myself a cup. Joel didn't look convinced. "You don't have to lie to me," he said softly, his voice steady. "I can tell when something's bothering you." His words made me grip the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. "Joel," I said, turning to face him with as much composure as I could muster. "We need to move past this. Whatever you think is happening here, it isn't." He tilted his head, his expression calm yet challenging. "You can say that all you want, Aunt Kate, but it doesn't change how I feel." "Or how you feel." "You know what?" I snapped suddenly. "Let me massage you." My stomach churned, and I set the mug down with a clatter, unable to suppress the frustration building inside me. "You don't know how I feel," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "And you don't get to tell me what I'm thinking." Joel stood, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. "I don't have to tell you," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's written all over your face." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unrelenting. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and it made me feel exposed in a way that was both infuriating and disarming. This isn't fair, I said finally, my voice breaking. You're twisting everything, making it seem like what? He interrupted, stepping closer. Like you're human? Like you deserve to be noticed? Appreciated? I recoiled slightly, the intensity of his words striking a nerve I hadn't realized was so raw. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't about me. It is, he said firmly. You just don't want to admit it. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of his gaze pinning me in place. My chest tightened as my mind raced for a way out, a way to diffuse the situation without acknowledging the truth in his words. I can't do this, I whispered, my hands trembling. I can't have this conversation. You don't have to, he said quietly. But you can't keep running from it. He stepped back then, his posture relaxing as he moved toward the door. I'm going for a walk, he said over his shoulder. You should think about what you really want. I stood frozen as he left, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in the quiet house. My thoughts felt like a whirlwind, each one more chaotic than the last. What did I want? The question was as terrifying as it was impossible to answer. Hours passed, but I couldn't shake the lingering tension. I busied myself with chores, hoping the repetitive motions would distract me. But my mind kept circling back to Joel's words, you deserve to be noticed. The truth of it gnawed at me, pulling at every thread of doubt and insecurity I had tried to bury. When the door finally opened again, I flinched, my heart racing as Joel stepped inside. His hair was damp from the cool air, and his cheeks were flushed, but his expression was calm. He didn't speak right away, simply removing his jacket and hanging it by the door. Did you think about what I said? He asked, his tone soft but unwavering. I don't want to talk about this, I said quickly, but my voice sounded weak. Okay, he said, his expression unreadable as he stepped closer. But I can't pretend that there is no tension between us, Aunt Kate. His words struck a chord I didn't want to acknowledge, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. This isn't right, I said, my voice barely audible. It can't be. Why not? He asked softly, his tone gentle but insistent. Because someone told you it's not? Because you've spent your whole life putting other people first? The lump in my throat made it impossible to respond, and I turned away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. Joel moved closer, his presence overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to stop him. You don't have to fight this, he said quietly, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. You don't have to fight me. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I felt my resolve begin to crumble. My mind screamed at me to push away, to put an end to this before it spiraled further. But my body betrayed me, I didn't move. Please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was pleading with, him or myself. Joel stepped around me, his hand brushing against mine as he turned me to face him. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. And for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there as the distance between us disappeared. Eventually, his hands went to places they weren't allowed to come. He ventured into uncharted territory, creating a stillness neither of us knew how to navigate. That stillness in the room was deafening. I was frozen, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. Joel's hand rested lightly on mine, his touch a tether to the moment we were trapped in. His gaze held mine steady and unrelenting, and I felt the walls I had so carefully built around myself begin to crumble. You don't have to keep pretending, he said eventually, his voice low and coaxing. You don't have to carry everything on your own. His words, spoken with such conviction, felt like a lifeline and a trap all at once. Joel, I whispered, my voice trembling. You don't understand. I do, he insisted, his tone firm but gentle. More than you think. I know how lonely you've been. I see it every day. And I want to help. Help? I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. This isn't help, this is. I broke off, unable to find the words. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something darker, something I didn't want to name. Joel's grip on my hand tightened slightly, grounding me, even as it sent my pulse racing. This is real, he said quietly, his gaze searching mine. And you know it. I wanted to deny him, to push him away and draw a line that couldn't be crossed. But the way he looked at me, such certainty, made it impossible. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in years. And despite every instinct telling me to run, I did the opposite. I laid there, letting his words sink in, letting the weight of them press against the fragile boundaries I had tried to hold on to. And so I kissed him. While we were kissing, his hands went even further, exploring places they had no business being. It felt amazing, crazy, even, that my own nephew was doing this. But after a moment, I pulled away. It doesn't matter if it's real, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. It's wrong. Why? He asked, his tone soft but insistent. Because someone told you it should be. Because you're afraid of what people will think. Yes, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Yes, I'm afraid. And you should be too. This isn't just about me, Joel. This is about what's right. His expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same quiet determination that had been there all along. I don't care what anyone else thinks, he said simply. I care about you. The sincerity in his voice sent a shiver through me, and I felt my resolve waver. For a moment, the room seemed to blur, the edges of reality softening as I stood on the precipice of something I couldn't take back. Joel's hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle. I closed my eyes, the weight of his presence overwhelming. I can't do this, I whispered, though the words felt hollow. You can, he said, his voice steady. You just have to let yourself. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze one last time. The intensity there was enough to make me falter. But then a sound broke through the moment, a sharp knock at the front door that shattered the silence like glass. My heart leapt into my throat as the spell between us broke, and I pulled away quickly, my hands trembling. Joel stepped back, his expression unreadable as he glanced toward the door. You should get that, he said, his voice calm but distant. I nodded, unable to speak as I moved toward the door, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. When I opened it, David stood on the other side, his face lighting up with a smile. Hey, he said cheerfully, stepping inside. Thought I'd surprise you and come home early. My stomach churned as I forced a smile, the weight of everything threatening to crush me. That's nice, I said weakly, stepping aside to let him in. As David moved into the house, his presence filled the space with an ease that felt foreign now. I glanced back toward the kitchen. Joel stood there, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intense as he watched us. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles, but I felt like I was moving through a dream, detached from the reality around me. Every time Joel entered the room, I felt my heart race. The tension between us was palpable, even in the most mundane moments. David didn't seem to notice, his attention focused on recounting his day at work and catching up on the news. When the house finally fell quiet that night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment in my mind. The weight of what had almost happened, of what might still happen, pressed heavily on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I knew I had to make a choice, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed again. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could.